I'm sorry. Let me show you to Helena's room. Saying so, she roughly took my luggage and started moving outside the house. A perfect room for Mom, right? Are you looking down on me? I yelled at my son, but he just laughed condescendingly. A storage room for an elderly person like Helena is good enough. Feel free to use this place. If you don't like it, you can leave. My son and his wife, after making me pay for this new house, now trying to kick me out once I'm no longer needed. Disgusted, I sighed and asked them, "Are you really okay with this?" "Yeah, please leave soon. It's a bother having you stay any longer." A month later, unaware that they would come crying to me, my son and his wife sent me away. I am Helena, a 60-year-old single mother. My husband died of illness 20 years ago. It was when my son Roland was just 10 years old. With no time to grieve, I started working multiple jobs to make ends meet. No matter how much I worked, it was always just enough to scrape by. So I relied on various connections and started investing to somehow make money. Whenever I was preparing to leave for work late at night, Roland would always wake up. Rubbing his sleepy eyes, he'd ask, "Mom, are you going to work again?" With a look of loneliness. It was heart-wrenching, but I had no choice but to go to work for our survival. I hugged my son and told him, "Be good and wait for me," as I left for work each day. By the time he was in middle school, Roland had gotten used to this lifestyle and stopped seeking my affection. Our conversations were limited to the bare minimum greetings and necessary communication. I accepted this with a sense of loneliness. However, I was immensely grateful that my son grew up healthy and strong. Roland left for college and started living on his own. As a mother, I was worried, but whenever I contacted him, he'd respond, "I'm living fine." Each time, I was relieved. After graduating from college, my son got a job at a top-tier company. After that, my son married a woman named Betty, introduced by a friend. Feeling anxious about living alone in my old age, I asked the two of them if I could live together with them, but Betty refused. "Helena, you're still healthy, aren't you? You can manage on your own. Please don't disturb our newlywed life." Honestly, I couldn't agree with Betty's cold response, but I apologized, saying, "You're right, I'm sorry," and decided to just watch over my son and his wife. However, their newlywed life was a mess that I couldn't bear to see. Soon after their marriage began, Roland called me over. When I arrived at their house, it was a disaster. Trash everywhere, clothes left where they were taken off, and dirty dishes piled in the sink. Betty was sprawled out on the sofa in the living room. When I asked what happened, Roland, looking troubled, scratched his head and said, "Betty's not good at housework. I try to do what I can after work, but it's piled up like this. Mom, could you help me clean up?" Oh, okay." Despite my presence as a mother-in-law, Betty continued to lie on the sofa. Was she feeling unwell? I asked Roland quietly, and he scratched his head again, troubled. "She's hungover." Looking closer, I noticed empty beer cans beside the sofa where Betty was sleeping. I sighed and shook her awake. "Betty, wake up. If you want to sleep, go to the bedroom, okay? You'll catch a cold." Betty finally woke up, but sluggishly retreated to the bedroom without a proper greeting. I might be seen as a nagging mother-in-law, but her attitude seemed incredibly unreasonable to me. As I cleaned, I asked Roland about their married life, and it seemed Betty, despite being a housewife, hardly did any chores and just lazed around. I started to worry about my son's marriage. After cleaning and tidying up with Roland, Betty never showed her face. The next day, she called to thank me, but my confusion remained. Roland, coming home from work, was greeted by a messy house and a wife who didn't do chores. I realized he must be exhausted. So I proposed to the couple, "I'll come over once a week." Betty was reluctant, but she quickly agreed when I said I'd do the housework and cleaning. Since then, I've been going to their condo once a week to do chores and clean. I tried to get Betty involved, but she showed no interest at all. Taking advantage of my reluctance to nag, Betty would say, "Helena will do it. I'll just watch and learn from the sofa," and return to the living room. I once firmly lectured her, but it had no effect. Seeing no change, I again proposed living together, but Betty refused, saying, "We're not a family from another world. I think it's strange to live together." Furthermore, she added, "Your weekly visits are a nuisance. Can you stop? Thanks to Helena, I can do most of the household chores now." I almost blurted out to my son, "Divorce that wife of yours." But he seemed happy with his life with Betty, and I couldn't say anything when he spoke of it joyfully. Now I live alone in a rented condominium. I reduced my visits to my son and his wife from weekly to monthly, watching over them quietly. Reflecting on those times, I wondered if I had interfered too much because I was worried about my son. Then one day, Betty showed up at my place. She had never visited me on her own since getting married. Surprised, I served her coffee and pie. After taking a sip of her tea, she started, "Helena, would you like to live with us?" Live together? I was so surprised by Betty's suggestion that I repeated her words. I never thought she, who had always firmly refused my proposals to live together, would bring it up. "Why do you want to live with me?" I asked. Betty replied with a wry smile. "At first, I wanted to enjoy our newlywed life, but after discussing it with Roland, we thought about your future. We're worried about letting you live alone." Betty didn't seem to be lying. She looked genuinely concerned about me. I felt ashamed for having cursed her in the past as such a wife of my son. "Thank you, Betty. I would love to live together." She smiled happily at my response. She said we would discuss the details later and left. Finally, I would be able to live with my son and his wife. I happily anticipated the life together with them. Later, they came to my house. When we started discussing living together again, Roland suggested, "Since we're going to live together, why don't we build a new house in a high-end residential area?" A new house in a high-end residential area? It seems my son and his wife had always dreamed of building a new home in a high-end residential area. They wanted to make this dream a reality by living together with me. My poor upbringing made me go through a lot of hardships, but building a new house in a high-end residential area as an adult, I can show them all, right? I think so too. I'll surely be able to boast about it to my future mom friends. Seeing them talk excitedly, I wondered if they were building a new house just to put on airs. I understand wanting to build a new house, but how will you afford it? Do you have that kind of money? When I asked this, Roland, with a serious expression, proposed something unbelievable. "About that, Mom, if you really want to live with us, could you help pay for the new house? If you can't contribute to the cost, then let's forget about living together. What do you think?" I was taken aback by their terms. It was clearly an unfavorable deal for me. But then I reconsidered. Living together would mean I'd be a burden to them. So maybe it's okay to contribute to the cost of the new house. Alright, I'll pay for it. When I agreed, their faces lit up, and they joyfully held hands. I felt a bit uneasy about their reaction, but if they were happy, then maybe it was okay, I thought, watching their excitement. A week later, my son, his wife, and I visited several real estate agents, discussing where to build our new house in the high-end residential area. We're thinking of building a house in a high-end residential area. We want a big plot with a garden and proper artificial turf. Their demands seemed a bit too idealistic, but the agent introduced us to properties courteously. I suggested, let's choose a property considering the future. But they didn't seem to hear me. After much searching and debating, they finally picked a plot in the most upscale area. It might not have space for a large garden, but perhaps enough for a courtyard. This is perfect! I can boast about this to everyone! Yeah, let's go for this one, Betty. Their happiness was truly heartwarming. We decided to purchase the land they liked and build a house there. A year later, the new house my son and his wife had dreamed of was finally built. On moving day, when I arrived at the new house, my son and his wife were already busy moving their things in. I approached them, offering help. You two are quick! Let me help! Oh, I brought my things too. Where should I put them? However, they acted as if they hadn't heard me and continued moving their belongings into the new house. I reluctantly placed my things beside the entrance and tried to help them. But as soon as I touched anything, they snatched it away, saying, "Mom, it's okay." Feeling increasingly distrusted by their cold attitude, I called out, "Hey, can you two stop for a moment and listen to me?" I clapped my hands to get their attention, and they reluctantly looked at me. "What is it, Mom? We're busy right now." Helena, what do you need?" Their responses irritated me, but I maintained my composure and asked, "I'm sorry to disturb you while you're busy. I've brought my things, but where should I put them?" They exchanged glances and then laughed, as if something was funny. Confused, I wondered what was amusing. "Sorry, Helena. Let me show you to your room. This way," Betty said, roughly taking my luggage and moving outside the house. I followed silently, and she led me to a spot, saying, "Here is Helena's room," and tossed my belongings carelessly. "What? This is a storage room!" I exclaimed in shock, and Betty giggled. Then Roland chimed in from behind. "What's the matter? It's a perfect room for Mom, right? Don't you like it? Are you looking down on me?" I yelled at Roland, but he just laughed condescendingly. "Really, this is why the elderly are such a nuisance." "The elderly?" I turned to Betty, glaring at her with intensity. She then pointed at the storage room with her thumb, smirking. "A storage room for an elderly person like Helena is good enough. Feel free to use it. If you don't like it, you can leave. We don't want to cause a disturbance in the neighborhood, right?" At that moment, I realized my son and his wife had lured me into paying for the new house by pretending to want to live together. Now that the house was built, I was no longer needed. They never intended to live with me from the start. I felt no anger towards my son and his wife, who were looking at me with a sly smile. I sighed and asked them, "Are you really okay with this? Can Roland manage the expenses on his income alone?" "Yeah, please leave quickly. It's a nuisance having you around." "That's right." I picked up my thrown belongings and walked away. Behind me, I heard my son and his wife saying, "That was too easy," and I'm glad it worked out. Where did I go wrong in raising my son? As I pondered this, I returned to living alone. A month later, one afternoon, the doorbell rang persistently and someone banged on the door. I thought it might be a debt collector at the wrong address and ignored it. Then I heard my son and his wife outside. "Mom, you're there, right? Please help us." "Please, Helena." Reluctantly, I opened the door to find them looking troubled. "Mom, you finally came out. Please, help us." "Helena, I'm begging you to. What's all this hurry about? Come in, at least." I let them into the living room and had them sit on the sofa. Then they started explaining. Apparently, Roland was fed up with Betty's attitude. Even after I stopped visiting, she continued to leave all the housework to him. Roland had turned a blind eye, thinking, it's okay if she can't do chores. But after moving into the upscale house, Betty started spending lavishly, enjoying a life of luxury, which built up his dissatisfaction. Betty, on the other hand, began to resent the limited income of my son, despite the change in their living standards. They couldn't afford the luxuries they expected in their upscale residence. Furthermore, they couldn't pay for their living expenses and mortgage, leading to a major fight. Realizing they were helpless, my son and his wife came to me for help. I was completely disillusioned by their selfishness. "Helena, please help us. If we can't pay the mortgage, we can't live in that house." "Please, Mom. We're family, right? Help us out." "Helena, if you pay the mortgage, we'll definitely live together this time. We won't deceive you anymore. Please." "Please, Mom. You want to live together, right?" I sighed, looking at the two of them begging desperately. Betty is one thing, but when did my son become such a pitiable adult? I thought about ignoring their pleas, but I also didn't want the house I paid for to go to waste. After taking a sip of my coffee, I said, "All right, I'll pay off the mortgage." "Really? Thank you so much, Helena." My son, his wife, and I quickly went to the bank. I paid off the mortgage in full from my savings, which I had set aside from my investment income for my old age and my grandchildren, and had the property transferred to my name. This should settle things. After I told them this, they looked relieved. "Mom, let's move to that house this weekend. Get ready." After being freed from their mortgage, they went home. That weekend, my son and his wife moved the belongings I had prepared to the new house. After unpacking and settling down, they said, "Helena, we look forward to living with you." "Mom, I'm so happy we can live together again." They were assuming as if it was natural to start living together with me. To them, I said, "I'm not going to live with you two." "What?" "Why not? We won't deceive you anymore." As they asked in confusion, I scolded them loudly. "Don't you understand what you've done? You tricked me into paying for the new house under the pretense of living together, then you kicked me out. Now you cling to me, saying, pay the mortgage so we can live together. How much more do you plan to disrespect me?" Betty staggered back, taken aback. Roland, flustered by my sudden anger, said, But you paid it." "I paid because I didn't want to waste the house built with my money, not to help you. A house is too good for people like you, who can't cherish others. Pack your things and leave. If you really want to stay, why don't you live in the storage room?" My son and his wife, unable to say anything, hung their heads, and clenched their fists. Eventually, Roland and Betty packed up their belongings and left the house. Gradually, they moved out all their furniture and appliances, and soon, no trace of their belongings was left in the house. They now live in a cheap apartment in Betty's hometown. The life they're leading now, after bragging about living in a luxury house, must be painful for them. I hope they'll come to realize their mistakes and learn from them. Meanwhile, I live alone in the luxurious house. Feeling lonely in the spacious house, I occasionally invited friends over for tea parties. Years later, I received a call from my son and his wife, whom I hadn't been in contact with for a while. "Mom, I'm truly sorry for what happened back then. I realize now how unreasonable we were. I'm sorry." "Helena, I deeply apologize." Their voices were weary. When I asked what happened, Roland told me about their life since then. His company had gone bankrupt, and they were left without income. Despite searching, they couldn't find jobs and were even struggling to pay their rent. It was only when they faced hardship that they realized their past mistakes and decided to apologize to me. When I said, "Come back home," they thanked me tearfully over the phone. A week later, they arrived at my house with their belongings and apologized deeply at the entrance. Sensing their sincere regret, I forgave them, and we began living together. I planned to build an equal family relationship with them going forward. They seemed like completely different people compared to years ago. Betty, who used to avoid housework and laze around, now took the initiative in doing chores, albeit clumsily, and began looking for a job. Roland was studying for qualifications while job hunting. I supported their living expenses with my savings, and eventually they both found jobs. On Mother's Day that year, they handed me cash, saying, "This is to make up for all the trouble we've caused you." "Mom, thank you. I'm really sorry for being such a shameful son." "Helena, I'm sorry for always being a burden." "It's all right, both of you. I'll gratefully accept this. Let's continue to support each other from now on." We smiled at each other happily. My son and his wife are now working hard at their jobs and in household chores to support me. Thanks to them, I'm spending a very enjoyable and happy retirement.